An angel stood before Mary. Okay, so just imagine if you were standing there and a big old angel full of the incredible presence and power of God was to suddenly stand right in front of you, and you could feel that presence and power with every fiber of your being, and you were like, pinch myself because I think I'm dreaming, and then you hear a noise, and what's that? Oh, it's my heart beating and racing and matching the racing of my mind, because holy crow, what is happening here? Mary is afraid. And we know this because the angel says to her, "Do not be afraid." At these words, Mary calms down enough to listen to what the angel is telling her. The angel tells Mary that she has pleased God. Wow, Mary must have had some strong relationship with God. And because God is pleased with her, she will bear God's son before she's married, which in those days was actually a pretty bad thing, because at best she could be humiliated and shunned. At worst, she could be killed for being pregnant out of wedlock. And it was possible even that Joseph would choose not to marry her in the end, because the child she was carrying wasn't his child. This is what it means to find favor with God? I mean, seriously, God? Is this what God does for those whom God favors? Puts them in stressful situations? I mean, now I'm starting to think about all those people in the Bible, you know, those people who had moments of intense stress because of their encounters with God. Name a person in the Bible, Tom, any person.
King David. He had it pretty good.
Yeah, okay. It ended up okay, except for that little part about Bathsheba. But early on it was different. As a youth, David was anointed by Samuel to be the next king, even while the present king was still king. And the present king, King Saul, kept trying to kill David. David was on the run for ages and ages, and he had to learn to trust in God utterly for his very life.
What about the Apostle Paul?
Oh, well, the Apostle Paul, yeah. Well, he zealously persecuted Christians at first, of course, and then Jesus caused him to go blind for a bit, and then he was utterly helpless in the hands of those who he'd been persecuting. That was no walk in the park, let me tell you. He had to turn his back on lots of stuff he believed and on his colleagues and in his buddies in order to follow Jesus. Things turned out okay for him, except perhaps being killed because of his faith. Bad, Carolyn. You know, really, that is through the worldly eyes, not through the eyes of faith that I said that, because Paul followed God. He found sustenance and life in God, and life with God was way more precious to him than life without God, even though it meant that he lived a shorter life when he was with God. But that's not the point I want to make right now. The point I want to make is you turn to God and blam, you're put face to face with the most stressful, agonizing, challenging times. You know, your life isn't quite your own. You have to learn to trust in God. It's like sink or swim. Wait just a second. I'm starting to get it now. It's about learning to trust in God, right? The people in the Bible, well, they were far from perfect, but there's one thing that unites all the people who genuinely tried to follow God, and that's that they had to learn to trust God. They chose to rely on God, and the more they counted on God to help them through life, the closer they grew to God, because they experienced the living God helping with them and guiding them, and they felt God's blessings. Jesus' mother Mary was no different. She responds to the angel's unexpected announcement with these words, "Here I am, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." Of course, Mary's life would never be the same. Whose life is the same when they follow God? Mary would bear the Son of God out in a cold stable, seemingly alone. She and Joseph would become refugees in Egypt to flee the evil King Herod. When her son grew up, as Simeon in the temple predicted, a figurative sword would pierce her own soul, and that's at the crucifixion. On the outside, through worldly eyes, it doesn't seem so great. Her life was full of stress and difficulties because of God. But if you look at this through eyes accustomed to seeing God, you start to see that Mary's life was deeply blessed, incredibly blessed, because she learned to trust God utterly and completely and fully. And you just know that her life had to be chock full to the brim and overflowing with God's incredible joy. This is the sort of pure, clear joy that was with the angels when they announced the birth of Jesus to the shepherds. This is the sort of joy that's the warp and woof of heaven. This is the sort of joy which is the union of the heart and mind and spirit with God, which is another way of saying being on the same wavelength with God. This is the sort of joy that springs alive in our hearts when we learn to entrust our lives to God. Of course, we don't feel it all the time because, life happens, right? Right now, today, life is stressed. Maybe you're stressed, I'm stressed. But in the middle of our stressful lives, God wants us to let go of our stress and trust God. God wants us to experience amazing joy. God wants us to know that we are favored by God when we turn to God. We are treasured by God, and that God will not fail us when we place our trust in God. Jesus came to earth to remind us that God is with us always, at the very center of our pains and problems in our life. And each of us can transcend beyond the pain and problems of our life, so we're living on God's wavelength. In short, choose God and keep your eyes on God, and you can expect to be filled by God, to be strengthened by God, to be nourished by God, to be deeply satisfied by God, even when life on earth throws you some curveballs.